It started with a number I couldn't explain. $15,000, gone from my account like clockwork every month. At first I thought it was a mistake, maybe something Gabriel had set up temporarily and forgot to cancel. But when I called the bank, what I uncovered wasn't a slip-up. It was a pattern. Transfers, loans, charges I never approved. And every trail led back to my son. In just 2 years, he had drained $340,000 from my life without a word. I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by statements and silence, wondering how I had missed what was happening right in front of me. And then it hit me. I remember the morning clearly, not because it was extraordinary, but because I had let myself believe it might be. It was Mother's Day, and I woke up early, wrapped in that soft kind of hope only a mother can carry. Quiet, persistent, often misplaced. I made coffee, sliced a piece of toast, and sat at the kitchen table staring at the wrapped box beside me. Inside was a professional-grade set of tools. German-made, the kind Gabriel had once mentioned during a rushed phone call I doubted he remembered. It had cost me nearly 2 months of my modest retirement income, but I told myself it was worth it. After all, how often do you get to give your only child a gift he might actually use? I had also picked out a bouquet of lilies for Isabella. Yes, I know. Some might think it odd to buy flowers for your daughter-in-law on Mother's Day, but I was still trying. 2 years into their marriage, I hadn't quite found my place in their family yet, but I figured small gestures helped pave the way. Maybe she'd smile and say thank you. Maybe she'd call me thoughtful. Maybe she'd think of me as more than Gabriel's mother. I drove across town in my aging Honda windows, down the box, and the flowers carefully positioned on the passenger seat. The car made its usual whirring noises when I hit 40, but I didn't mind. It was an honest sound. Nothing hidden, nothing showy. When I reached Gabriel's house, I noticed the driveway was already full. There were cars lining the street, people gathered in the backyard, laughter carrying through the open gate. I smiled, feeling that flutter of belonging stir in my chest. Maybe this would be the year I felt included, not just invited out of obligation. I parked a few houses down and carried the box and flowers carefully up the sidewalk. The sun was bright and the flowers were beginning to wilt slightly, but they still looked lovely. As I approached the house, I could hear Gabriel's voice rising above the crowd. And this, he announced with unmistakable pride, is for you, Camila. I stopped just before turning the corner. The air changed. There was a pause, then a collective gasp followed by applause, cheers, and someone even whistling. I stepped forward and saw it. Gleaming in the driveway like a trophy. A brand new silver Mercedes-Benz ribbon still fluttering in the wind. Camila, Isabella's mother, stood beside it, hands pressed to her mouth in dramatic surprise, then wrapped her arms around Gabriel. "You shouldn't have," she cried. "I wanted to." Gabriel replied, grinning from ear to ear. "You've been so supportive." Someone shouted, "Now that's how you treat a mother." Another added, "That must have cost a fortune." Isabella was already on her phone live streaming the moment to her followers. "Look what my husband got my mom," she gushed. "A $200,000 surprise for the world's best mother-in-law." I stood there, still holding the box and the flowers invisible in plain sight. A few people noticed me then. One woman smiled awkwardly and stepped aside. Gabriel finally turned as if I had just arrived unannounced, though I was precisely on time. "Mom," he called out, walking over with a sheepish look. "You made it." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "This is for you." I shifted the gift box in my arms and took the envelope. It was thin, soft from being handled too much. I opened it right there. Inside was a gift card. $50. Department store. My throat went dry. I looked at the card, then at him. "Thank you," I managed, forcing my voice to sound cheerful. "That's very kind. I've been really busy this week," he added quickly. "But I'll make it up to you next weekend. We'll do something, I promise." I nodded, swallowing the lump forming behind my smile. The moment passed. People returned to circling the car. Camila opened the driver's side door and squealed over the leather seats. Someone asked for a photo. Isabella continued filming. No one noticed me anymore. I stood there holding 2 gifts no one had asked for and no one wanted. My son had just handed over a luxury vehicle to a woman he had known for 2 years, while his own mother stood clutching a discount card like a consolation prize. But I didn't cry. Not then. Instead, I placed the tool set gently by the door and left the flowers in a vase on their kitchen counter without a word. I stepped back outside, walked down the same sidewalk I had just walked up, and sat in my old Honda for a long while before I drove away. There was no shouting, no confrontation, just silence. The kind that fills the car when the world has just told you where you stand. And for the first time in a long time, I began to wonder if maybe it was time I stood somewhere else. I stayed for lunch. I don't know why exactly. Maybe it was pride, maybe it was hope that things might shift. Maybe someone would remember I was there. But mostly I think I stayed because walking away would have made the pain feel more real. Staying gave me a few more minutes to pretend. They had set up long folding tables in the backyard decorated with simple yellow tablecloths and mismatched chairs. The sun was warm, and the smell of grilled chicken and roasted vegetables filled the air. It should have felt like a celebration. But for me, it felt like I'd wandered into someone else's party, invited by mistake. Camilla sat at the center of the main table like a guest of honor, her laughter carrying effortlessly above the chatter. Gabriel was beside her, still glowing with the praise and admiration people were pouring over him. "I've never seen a son-in-law so generous," one of Isabella's aunts gushed. "You're an angel, Gabe." Gabriel waved it off, trying to appear modest. "She deserves it. Camilla's done so much for us. She always speaks so highly of you," Isabella added. "Honestly, my mom's like a second mother to him." I sat at the far end of the table between a child I didn't know and a neighbor who kept checking his phone. No one really looked my way. I had to pour my own iced tea. I passed the bread basket down without anyone saying thank you. When I cleared my throat to make a small comment about the weather, no one responded. And Gabriel, my Gabriel, he didn't even glance in my direction. At one point, someone asked him how he managed such a generous gift on top of everything else. He chuckled and leaned in slightly, lowering his voice, just enough to sound humble. "Well, he said Camilla has some important connections at the hospital. She knows a few people on the board, and her neighbor used to be the hospital's CFO. It's not just a gift, it's an investment, really." Camilla laughed. "You make it sound so strategic." Gabriel smiled. "Let's just say it's smart to keep good relationships with the right people. An investment." That word rang in my ears like an alarm bell. Investment. I turned slightly, watching the way they beamed at each other. Camilla nodded proudly. Isabella placed a hand on Gabriel's shoulder. Everyone nodded, murmuring approval. So that's what this was. Not love, not appreciation, not even celebration. It was business. I shifted in my chair and looked down at my plate. The green beans had gone cold and the chicken was dry. I took a sip of water and tried not to choke on my own breath. I had spent nearly all of my monthly budget buying him that toolbox. I had bought flowers for his wife. I had thought of every detail, hoping he'd see my heart in those gifts. Meanwhile, he had used my money, though I didn't know it at the time, to buy a car for someone else. And not just someone else, a woman who had known him for 2 years. While I had known him for his entire life, they toasted Camilla again. "To the best mother-in-law in the world." She laughed and raised her glass. "And to Gabriel, the best son-in-law anyone could ever ask for." They clinked glasses. Gabriel took a sip, basking in the applause. I didn't raise mine. I couldn't. I kept hearing the word investment like it was a punchline in a joke I didn't understand. Was I a bad investment? Was that it? Was I no longer of use to him now that my savings were dwindling and my presence wasn't flashy? Was I only valuable when I was giving? I glanced toward the kids, Sophia and Lucas, chasing each other around the yard, They were laughing. Their laughter was the only part of the day that felt real. No one noticed when I excused myself. I walked slowly inside, pretending I needed to use the restroom. I lingered in the hallway, then stepped into the guest bathroom and locked the door behind me. I stared at myself in the mirror. I saw a woman who looked tired, older than her years. Her blouse was slightly wrinkled from the drive her lipstick faded. Her eyes, my eyes, were glassy but dry. Not yet. I turned on the faucet just to fill the silence, then shut it off again. I didn't cry then. Not yet. After a few minutes, I flushed the toilet to keep up the illusion and returned to the table. No one had noticed I was gone. After dessert, I stood up and announced that I needed to leave a little early. Isabella barely looked up. Camilla smiled and said, "Thanks for coming, Dolores." Gabriel gave me a half hug without standing. "Thanks for the tools, Mom. I'll open them later." I nodded and walked out, my purse clutched tightly under my arm. The sun had shifted, casting longer shadows across the sidewalk. The Honda sat in the same spot, patient and familiar. I started the engine and waited for the air to turn cool before pulling away. And that's when the tears came. Not a gentle stream, but a flood. Hot and sharp, rushing over me without warning. I had to pull over a few blocks down. I turned off the car, pressed my forehead to the steering wheel, and let myself sob the way I hadn't in years. I cried for the years I gave him. I cried for the birthdays I worked through to pay tuition. I cried for every silent moment I excused, every unreturned call I forgave. I cried for the woman in the mirror who had smiled through being invisible. I cried because I finally understood something no mother wants to admit. My son didn't see me anymore. Not as a person, not as a mother, and certainly not as someone worth more than a $50 card and a "sorry, I've been busy." When the tears slowed, I sat up and wiped my face with a napkin from the glove compartment. I took a deep breath and stared out at the quiet street. Something inside me had cracked, but in the stillness I realized it was also the sound of something beginning, something I hadn't felt in a long, long time. Resolve. 3 days after that disastrous Mother's Day lunch, I sat down at my kitchen table with a mug of lukewarm coffee and my checkbook. I hadn't been able to sleep and my appetite had vanished. Everything about that day had left a strange taste in my mouth, one I couldn't rinse out with tea or understanding. I needed something to distract me, so I told myself I'd go over my monthly budget. That at least was familiar, but something caught my eye. A charge I didn't recognize. Then another, and another. A monthly automatic transfer. $15,000. Going out like clockwork. I blinked. At first I thought I was reading it wrong. $15,000, I hadn't authorized that. Not recently. I hadn't made any big financial decisions since the year before. I pulled out my last few statements, laid them out like puzzle pieces, and began scanning each line item with a growing knot in my chest. The same number. Every month. Same recipient. Gabriel. I felt the breath catch in my throat. It had to be a mistake. Maybe a temporary loan I had forgotten about. He'd asked for help before. For the kids' school, for a down payment on the apartment. Maybe he had set something up and didn't cancel it. But $15,000. Every month I picked up the phone and dialed the bank, fingers trembling slightly. I asked to speak with Fernando, the account manager who had handled my finances for years. He answered warmly as always. "Of course, Mrs. Dolores. Let me pull up your file." There was a pause, then the rustle of papers or keystrokes on the other end. "Yes, I see the transfers," he said. "They've been active for the past 8 months. You signed off on them in person. Gabriel came with you. You said it was for medical equipment for his private clinic." I froze. I remembered going to the bank with him, yes. He'd said it was urgent. Something about a temporary investment that needed to be handled quickly. I trusted him. I had always trusted him. But that was just one transfer, wasn't it, Fernando? I asked, my voice quieter now. "Can you send me a complete statement of all account activity from the last 2 years? Every transfer? Every loan? Every credit card payment? Of course, Mrs. Dolores, I'll email it right away. I thanked him, hung up, and sat in complete silence. Less than a minute later, the email arrived. What I saw made my stomach turn. There it was in black and white. Month after month of transfers I didn't remember, loan approvals I hadn't fully understood, and thousands of dollars in credit card payments that had nothing to do with me. Clinic renovation, $25,000 in March. Emergency surgery for Isabella, $15,000 in May. State-of-the-art diagnostic equipment, $30,000 in June. None of it added up. Gabriel wasn't even listed as a co-owner of the clinic. Isabella had been posting dancing videos on social media the week she was supposedly recovering from surgery, and I'd seen no equipment. Only new handbags, upgraded phones, luxury vacations. The numbers didn't lie, but they made a liar out of my son. I spent the rest of the day buried in paperwork. I printed every statement, highlighted every line that looked suspicious, and stacked everything in chronological order. I double-checked receipts, cross-referenced calendar events, and even looked through old text messages just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. By the time the sun went down, I had a number. $340,000. That's how much of my money had gone to Gabriel over 2 years. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the chaos on my kitchen table. Statements, highlighters, calculator, half-eaten toast. My hands trembled slightly, but not from age. From realization. Gabriel had taken nearly everything. Not all at once, no. He was too smart for that. It had been slow, quiet, like a leak in a roof you don't notice until the ceiling caves in. I tried to tell myself he had meant well, that he believed he'd pay it back, that he thought he was helping his family. But no matter how I twisted the logic, the core truth remained. He had betrayed me. Not just financially, emotionally. He had looked me in the eye, thanked me for birthday cards and casseroles, hugged me on holidays, and asked how I was, while knowing he was draining my life savings to impress people who barely knew him. He didn't see me as his mother anymore. He saw me as funding, a resource, an ATM with a familiar face. I sat there until my back hurt and my legs went numb. When I finally stood, I looked out the window at the backyard, now dark and still. My little herb garden, the one thing I still did for myself, swayed slightly in the evening breeze. All I could think was, how had I been so blind? I had told myself for years that my sacrifices were love. That giving everything for your child was what good mothers did. That needing nothing in return was noble. But now, for the first time, I wondered if it was something else. Maybe it was fear. Fear of losing him. Fear of being alone. Fear of feeling useless. And in that fear, I had handed over my independence piece by piece until I was a shell of the woman I used to be, quietly applauding his success while he used my silence to strip me of my dignity. I thought of the car he gave Camilla. Shiny, brand new, wrapped in a red bow like a scene from a movie. Paid for, quite literally, by my years of labor, my missed vacations, my late-night overtime, my small dreams that were always pushed aside. He had given away my life, and I had smiled for a photo while he did it. I turned off the lights and went to bed that night without brushing my teeth, without folding the laundry, without returning the calls I had ignored all day. I lay awake for hours staring at the ceiling, counting numbers in my head like they were sheep. $15,000 a month, 8 months, plus loans, plus lies, $340,000. And the worst part, it wasn't the money. It was knowing my son had stopped seeing me as a person long before I stopped seeing myself. It started with a phone call, then 2, then 12. By Tuesday afternoon, I had 47 missed calls from Gabriel. I didn't answer a single one, not because I wanted to punish him, but because I needed silence. Silence to breathe, to think, to not fall back into the familiar pattern of rushing to rescue, of softening my voice, of pretending I didn't know what I knew. Then came the 13th call, and this time I picked up. "Mom," he said, his voice already frantic. "Something's wrong. My card was declined at the pharmacy. I called the bank. They said the automatic transfers were stopped. And the credit line. What happened? I canceled them, I replied calmly, as if I were commenting on the weather. This morning? There was a pause on the other end so thick I could hear his breath catch. You? What? Why would you do that? I discovered some things. Gabriel, I said, some very interesting things. Would you like to come by so we can talk? 15 minutes later. Tires screeched in my driveway. From the kitchen window, I watched him get out of the car, his steps fast and angry, his face red and tight. He didn't knock. He just burst in. Mom, what the hell is going on? I stayed seated at the table where I had laid out every page, every receipt, every transfer and signature from the last 2 years. Sit, I said quietly. We're going to talk like adults. He hesitated, then sat down stiffly on the edge of the chair like it might burn him. I want you to reactivate everything he said. This is not okay. You've put me in a very difficult position. I looked at him hard. And what are you offering me in return? He blinked. Return. I'm your son. Yes, and I'm your mother, not your investor. His eyes flickered toward the papers between us. I can explain. Good, I interrupted. I picked up the first statement and pushed it toward him. Let's start here. March, $15,000 for medical equipment. What equipment? He didn't answer. I picked up another, April. $20,000 for Isabella's medical emergency. What emergency? I talked to her the next day. She was posting beach photos. Still no answer. And this one I continued holding up the document like it was Exhibit A. June, $30,000 for a clinic investment. Which clinic? You're not even listed as an owner. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. You lied, Gabriel, I said softly but firmly. Repeatedly. For 2 years. You looked me in the eyes, called me Mom, and took my money like it meant nothing. He slumped back, running a hand through his hair. I needed to maintain a certain image. You don't understand. Camila's family, they have money, real money, connections, expectations. If I don't keep up, I'm just another guy with a degree, using my retirement to keep up appearances. It was temporary, he said quickly. I always meant to pay you back. When you're 50, 60. When I'm dead? His face twisted. Don't say that. I stood slowly and walked toward the window. The backyard was quiet. Beethoven, my dog, lay asleep under the tree, unaware that the house was full of the weight of everything unsaid. You didn't just spend my money, I said, turning back to him. You spent my trust. You took my love and turned it into a transaction. He buried his face in his hands. I didn't know how to tell you the truth. I was afraid you'd be disappointed. Disappointed, I echoed. Gabriel. I worked 60-hour weeks for 15 years so you could go to college. I sold your father's watch, the one thing he left behind to pay for your medical boards. I never remarried because I didn't want to take anything away from you. And you were afraid I'd be disappointed. He was crying now, the kind of crying that comes when a person realizes too late that a bridge may be burning. Give me a chance, Mom, he whispered. One last chance. I can fix this. I can sell the car. I can get a second job. I'll pay you back. I looked at him for a long time, and I saw a man I had raised but didn't truly recognize. Gabriel, I said, sitting back down. Do you know what hurts the most? It's not the money. It's that you never saw me. Not really. You saw what I could give you. You saw safety. You saw comfort. But you didn't see me. He wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt. I thought you'd understand. I do understand, I said. I understand you chose to give a $200,000 car to your mother-in-law while handing me a $50 card like a guilty afterthought. You made a clear statement about who matters. And I heard it. He winced. That wasn't the intention. But that was the result, I replied. And now I'm making a statement of my own. What do you want from me? He asked, voice strained. Nothing, I said. Standing again? For the first time in your life, Gabriel, I want absolutely nothing from you. And I expect the same. He stared at me like I had just walked away from a burning house without looking back. I love you, he whispered. I know, I replied. But love without respect isn't love. It's dependency. And I won't fund it anymore. And with that, I gathered the papers, put them back into their folder, and walked out of the room. Behind me, I heard nothing but silence. A heavy, sobering silence. And it was the first time I had heard my house breathe. The morning after Gabriel left my house in silence, I stood at the edge of my garden holding a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The rosemary bush had started blooming, and a hummingbird hovered nearby wings, whirring, unaware of the quiet shift in my world. For the first time in decades, I didn't wake up thinking about someone else's needs. I didn't check my phone for messages or my calendar for emergencies. The house felt still, but it wasn't the suffocating stillness of loneliness. It was the calm that comes after a storm passes when you're finally safe enough to exhale. I didn't know what came next, but I knew it wouldn't be what came before. I started small. I unsubscribed from every alert and banking notification tied to Gabriel's name. I organized my desk, threw away years of receipts and paperwork I'd kept just in case. I opened the linen closet and finally donated the pile of blankets and towels I had saved in case he or Isabella ever needed to stay over. That night, I opened a drawer I hadn't touched in years. Inside was a faded leather-bound journal. Clara's notebook. My husband had always kept notes, little reminders and reflections scribbled in his precise handwriting. I hadn't been able to bring myself to read it after he passed. I was afraid of what it might stir. But something told me it was time. The first few pages were ordinary. Grocery lists, doodles, notes about work. But then I turned to a page marked with a yellow post-it. The ink slightly smudged from time. Dolores, it read. If something happens to me, please remember raising a strong child is more important than raising a comfortable one. Don't protect him from every struggle. Don't give him the easy road. He needs to earn his life. Love him, but don't hand him everything. I sat back, clutching the notebook against my chest. Clara had seen it, long before I did. She'd always had that quiet clarity, that way of seeing the future without fear, and I had tried to be both mother and father. I'd given too much. Not because I didn't love Gabriel, but because I did. So much that I forgot where he ended, and I began. I flipped to another page. Her handwriting again. I'm afraid Dolores won't know when to stop giving. She has the softest heart I've ever known, and I worry she'll confuse love with sacrifice until she forgets to live for herself. That sentence sat with me all afternoon. By evening, I had made a decision. The next day, I walked into the local dance studio. The sign on the window said, "Beginner Salsa, Tuesdays and Thursdays." I stood awkwardly near the front desk until a woman named Carol approached me with a kind smile and a clipboard. "You here for the class, I think?" So I said, unsure of myself, "Is it okay if I just try?" She nodded. "It's more than okay. Welcome." It had been over 30 years since I'd danced with anyone. My steps were clumsy and I was always a beat behind, but something about the music and movement, feeling my body, remembering I had a body, woke something up in me I didn't know I'd lost. Later that week, I walked by the bookstore downtown and saw a poetry collection I had admired in the window months ago, but never allowed myself to buy. It wasn't practical. It wasn't for anyone else. But this time I walked inside and bought it for myself. No discount, no hesitation. Back home, I made tea curled up by the window and read every page aloud like I was speaking directly to the parts of me I had long ignored. And then one quiet Sunday morning, I opened my laptop and typed into the search bar Patagonia travel packages for solo travelers. Clara and I had always dreamed of going. It was the trip we said we'd take once Gabriel graduated, once the clinic was stable, once we had time. But the time never came. Clara passed before we ever got to plan it. Now all those old onces had lost their power. There was no one left to wait for. I found a travel agency with a friendly site and called the number. "Hello," a woman answered. "This is Carla at Global Journeys." "Hi, Carla," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "My name is Dolores. I'd like to see Patagonia." There was a pause, then a warm laugh. "What a beautiful choice. When are you thinking?" I looked out the window at the blooming rosemary. "Soon," I said. "As soon as possible. I've waited long enough." Carla's voice softened. "I think you're going to love it. Let's make it happen." When I hung up, I didn't feel reckless. I didn't feel selfish. I felt awake. I spent the next few days gathering what I needed. Hiking boots, a new coat, a proper backpack. I packed slowly, deliberately, as though I were packing up a version of myself that would never be coming back. Before I left, I lit a candle next to Clara's photo. "We're finally doing it," I whispered. "I'm going for both of us." And with that, I walked out the door, not as a mother-in-waiting, not as a woman forgotten, but as Dolores. Just Dolores. For the first time in decades, I wasn't running to anyone. I was running toward myself. The flight to Patagonia was long and quiet, and for most of it, I stared out the window at the clouds below. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't excited either. What I felt was something harder to name. A strange mixture of peace and disbelief, like waking up one morning and realizing your house had always had a secret door, and today you'd finally opened it. When the plane touched down in Buenos Aires, the air felt different. Cleaner, crisper, unfamiliar, in a way that didn't scare me. I transferred to a small connecting flight and landed in El Calafate, a quiet town at the edge of the world. From there, a guide picked me up along with 6 other travelers, all strangers, all quiet in that same way that happens when people are carrying too much inside. On the first evening, we hiked along the base of a glacier. The sun was low, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. I walked in silence, every crunch of my boots against the frozen earth, reminding me that I was here, truly here, far away from bank statements, unpaid emotional debts, and carefully chosen words that had cost me too much to say. We stopped at a clearing where the glacier curved like a sleeping giant. Everyone pulled out cameras and phones. I didn't. I just stood there, letting the wind hit my face, letting the cold remind me I was still alive. That night, back at the small lodge, we gathered around a fireplace. The room smelled like wood smoke and tea. I took a seat near the edge, wrapped in a thick blanket, still unsure if I belonged among these people with their hiking packs and confident eyes. That's when Maria and João approached me. A couple from Brazil, both in their 70s, with warm smiles and a gentle presence that made you feel like you'd met them before. First time traveling alone, Maria asked, her accent soft and musical. I nodded. First time traveling at all, really. Alone, yes. João handed me a cup of tea. Then we toast to that, to first times. We talked casually for a while. About the cold, the views, the food. Then Maria leaned in. "Do you have children?" she asked. "I have a son," I said, pausing. "Gabriel, he's 38. João smiled. "Our youngest is 42. Paulo." I looked at them. Something about the way they said his name made me ask, "Was he always easy?" Maria laughed, but there was sadness beneath it. "Oh no. Paulo was never easy." They told me their story slowly, like unfolding a letter that had been folded too many times. Paulo had always needed help. First with rent, then with a failed restaurant, then with debt from a bad marriage. He had 2 children and used them as anchors, ways to keep his parents emotionally tethered. We gave him everything, João said, and he always needed just a little more. One day, Maria added, "We found out he had forged our signature for a bank loan. $100,000. I gasped softly. He said he knew we'd forgive him. Because we always had. I looked down at my tea, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. "What did you do?" I asked. We said no. João answered. Maria reached for his hand. We cut him off. Completely. For 3 years, we didn't hear from him. Was it hard, I asked. The hardest thing we've ever done, Maria said. But also the kindest. João nodded. When we stopped saving him, he had to save himself. Now Maria smiled. He works hard. He's present with his kids. He visits us without asking for anything. He finally became a man. Their story sat inside me like a stone in still water, creating ripples long after our conversation ended. That night I lay in my small bed and thought about what they'd said. Cutting someone off doesn't mean cutting them out. Sometimes love means stepping back. Sometimes saying no is the most faithful act of care we can offer. Over the next few days, I let Patagonia move through me. I stood at the foot of ancient mountains, felt the roar of collapsing ice, and watched condors soar above canyons that made human worries feel like dust. I walked paths carved by wind and time, and I breathed more deeply than I had in years. On one of the last nights, we sat beneath a sky filled with stars. No city lights, no noise, just the vast, overwhelming quiet of the world as it was always meant to be. João raised a small glass. To parents who learn to say no, Maria added. And to children who eventually understand why. I raised my glass too, not just in agreement, but in gratitude. For strangers who told me the truth without knowing how badly I needed to hear it. For the quiet strength I'd finally begun to uncover in myself. In that moment, I knew something for certain. I hadn't come to Patagonia to escape my life. I had come to remember it, to reclaim it, to begin it again. And I would carry that beginning home with me like a souvenir no one else could see. But that would change everything. I returned from Patagonia with wind still in my hair and a quiet fire in my chest. The woman who stepped back into my little home wasn't the same one who had left. My bags were heavier with souvenirs, yes, but also with something far less visible. I came home carrying peace, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything. I didn't feel behind or broken. I just felt free. The first thing I did was adopt a dog. His name was Beethoven. He was a mutt with patchy black fur, big eyes, and a bark far louder than his body suggested. I found him at a local shelter, curled up in the back corner, uninterested in attention. They told me he'd been overlooked by others because he was older. That was all I needed to hear. We understood each other instantly. With Beethoven following me from room to room, I started making small changes that added up to something big. I rearranged the furniture in the living room. I planted fresh herbs in my garden, rosemary, basil, and thyme, and I smiled every time I caught the scent through the kitchen window. One afternoon, I passed a flyer taped to the bulletin board at the library cooking class for seniors. Learn to love your kitchen again. I signed up without hesitation. Tuesday mornings soon became my favorite part of the week. I stood among strangers in aprons, chopping onions, burning omelets, and laughing more than I had in years. I pulled my old guitar from the back of the closet, the one Clara had given me for our 10th anniversary. The strings were dull, but my hands remembered the chords. I played slowly at first, just a few bars here and there, but the more I played, the more something loosened inside me. Music had been the first thing I gave up when Gabriel was born. Now it came back to me like an old friend who forgave me for forgetting. And then there was Elena. We met in the library's book club. She was standing by the nonfiction shelf, debating whether or not to reread a memoir she had already underlined to death. I made a joke about how we never learned the lesson the first time anyway. She laughed. Really laughed. And we started talking. Elena was 68, sharp-witted and warm with silver curls and eyes that didn't miss much. Over coffee, she told me about her son, how addiction had taken him in and spit him out, how she had nearly bankrupted herself trying to save him, how she finally stopped when she realized she was only drowning with him. He hated me for it, she said, but hating me forced him to stand on his own 2 feet. Did he ever thank you, I asked. She smiled. Not with words, but he's still alive, and I think that's enough. Elena had a way of speaking that felt like wisdom wrapped in kindness. She never tried to fix me or give advice I didn't ask for. She just listened, and when she spoke, it felt like looking into a mirror that showed not who you were, but who you could be. We started spending Thursday evenings together, cooking, walking, Beethoven, talking in the garden while the sun dipped low. She taught me how to make risotto and how to set boundaries, how to say, "That's enough," and mean it without guilt. You can love someone with your whole heart, she told me one night, and still choose not to lose yourself in the process. I wrote that down. In fact, I started writing everything down. It began as scribbles in the margins of my cookbooks, then paragraphs in a notebook, then full pages typed on my old laptop. I didn't know what I was doing exactly, only that I needed to capture it, to pour it all out while it was still alive in me. So I wrote the truth, about raising Gabriel alone, about Clara's journal, about the Mercedes and the gift card and the tears I cried on the side of the road, about the silence that followed and the garden that grew in its place. I wrote about how we confuse love with loyalty, sacrifice with purpose, and how sometimes the most loving act is not what you give but what you refuse to keep giving. At first I didn't plan to show anyone. It was just for me, a way to process, to heal, to understand. But Elena read a few pages one afternoon and said, "You're not just writing your story, you're writing mine, and hers, and probably half the women in this town." That night I emailed a small local press that published personal essays. A month later I received an acceptance letter and a modest check. But more than that, I received a letter from a woman in Wisconsin who wrote, "You gave words to a pain I thought was only mine. I cried when I read it. Not out of sadness, but because I finally felt seen. Not as someone's mother, not as someone's past, but as myself, Dolores. A woman with a dog named Beethoven, a garden that bloomed late, a guitar that still held music, and a heart that had learned, painfully, slowly, beautifully, to beat for herself. For the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel used or invisible or necessary, only when I could give. I felt whole, complete. Not because of what I had done for others, but because of what I was finally willing to do for me. And in that wholeness, I began to write the story that you are hearing now. Not to relive the pain, but to prove that healing is possible. That even after decades of silence, you can find your voice. That even after years of giving everything, you can still reclaim what matters: yourself. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring, just as the garden was waking up again. The rosemary bush had come back fuller than ever, and Beethoven was stretched out beneath it, soaking in the late sunlight. I was sitting on the porch with a glass of iced tea, flipping through a seed catalog, when I heard the car pull up. I knew the sound of his steps before I saw him. Gabriel. I hadn't seen him in over a year. He stepped out of a modest sedan, not the BMW I'd helped pay for, not the polished shell of status he once clung to. He looked different, thinner. His clothes were wrinkled. There were dark circles under his eyes, but his shoulders were less stiff, like he was no longer carrying the weight of pretending. "Hi, Mom," he said, his voice low, almost hesitant. Beside him, Sophia and Lucas ran up the walkway with wide grins. "Grandma Dolores," Lucas shouted. Beethoven got so big they threw their arms around me before I could even stand. I hugged them tightly, breathing in the scent of peanut butter and grass. They had grown so much. Gabriel stayed back, one hand gripping the porch rail like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "Come in," I said softly. "Of course." We didn't talk much during lunch. The children chattered about school, their new puppy, a science project involving homemade volcanoes. Gabriel helped set the table without being asked, filled water glasses without making a show of it. He didn't look at his phone once. After the meal, the kids took Beethoven to the backyard. I made fresh lemonade, and Gabriel asked, "Can we sit on the porch?" We did, side by side, just like old times. But everything was different. He didn't speak at first, just looked out at the garden, watching the wind play with the tall grass near the fence. "I lost the apartment," he said finally. "It went into foreclosure 6 months ago. We rent now. Small place. But it's enough." I nodded. I lost my position at the hospital, too. Fernando let me go when I couldn't keep up appearances. The car got repossessed. We had to pull the kids out of private school. I didn't say anything. He glanced at me. Laura and I are separated. She works at a public clinic now. I pick up shifts at a rural hospital. It's quieter, less money, but more honest. I kept my hands wrapped around my glass. I didn't come to ask for anything, he added quickly. Not money, not a second chance. I know I burned that down. I looked at him then, really looked at him. He wasn't the polished, ambitious man who had once stood proudly next to a luxury car bought with stolen savings. He was just a son, tired, stripped down perhaps for the first time real. I came, he said, because I want to start over. Not to fix anything, not to go back, but to get to know you, as a person, as someone I should have seen before. My breath caught for a second. He kept his gaze steady. You raised me. You gave me everything. And I never asked who you were, what you loved, what you lost. I saw you as what I needed. But I never saw you, so. We sat there in the silence that followed, broken only by the distant laughter of Sophia and Lucas chasing Beethoven through the yard. I don't know if we can go back, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Too much was taken. I know, he replied. I don't expect to. I want to begin. Whatever that looks like. Whatever you're willing to share. I looked out across the lawn. The rosemary had bloomed bright this year. I had planted it with no expectations, just the hope that it might come back stronger. I turned back to him. All right, I said. Let's begin. And so we did. We didn't talk about the past that afternoon. We didn't bring up numbers or betrayals or the silence that had stretched between us for over a year. Instead, we talked about the garden, about how I'd learned to make risotto, about a book I was reading, about how he had started playing guitar again. Cheap one from a thrift store, but good enough to make music. It was awkward, uneven, like learning a new language with someone you used to know. But there was no tension, no expectation, just two people trying. That night, as he gathered the children to leave, Lucas turned and whispered, "Can we come back next week, Grandma?" I smiled. "Of course you can. Always." Gabriel lingered a moment at the door. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For not closing the door forever." I paused. "Gabriel, I did close it. You just knocked with the right hand this time." He nodded slowly, and for the first time there was no defensiveness in his face. Just quiet acceptance. As they drove away, I stood on the porch, hand resting on the wooden frame of the doorway, watching the taillights disappear down the street. Something had shifted. We weren't healed. We weren't whole. But we had started. And sometimes that's more than enough. Gabriel began visiting every other Sunday. At first it was simple. He'd bring the kids, help me carry in groceries, sit quietly during lunch, and ask about my garden or the book I was reading. There were no sudden tears, no awkward apologies, just a gentle rhythm we both leaned into, like learning to walk beside each other without stepping on old bruises. It took a few months before he came alone. It was a quiet morning in late summer when he showed up with a bag of oranges and a loaf of bread from a local bakery. I poured coffee and we sat at the kitchen table. The window cracked open, letting in the sound of birds and the smell of rosemary. "I moved," he said, slicing the bread slowly. "About 6 weeks ago. To a small town outside the city." I looked up. "You didn't mention that last time." "I wasn't ready to say it out loud," he admitted. "It's different there. Slower. The people at the hospital actually know each other's names. We eat lunch together in the break room. Nobody's trying to get promoted." He paused. "It's not glamorous, Lem. The pay's not great, but it feels real. And for the first time in a long time, I feel useful. Not impressive, just useful." I nodded, taking in the words. Not because they were extraordinary, but because they were ordinary. Honest. "I rent a small place," he continued. A little house with chipped paint and a backyard full of weeds. I pull them on weekends. It feels good. Sophia and Lucas visit twice a month. Laura's doing okay. We're taking things slow. He didn't say any of it like a plea for sympathy. It was just his life now. Stripped down, unvarnished. His voice had changed too. Softer, steadier, like someone who had stopped pretending he had all the answers. "I want to say thank you," he said after a pause. "Not for the money, not for what you gave me back then, but for cutting me off." I raised an eyebrow, unsure where he was going. "If you hadn't," he said, "I think I would have kept drowning. But slowly, the kind of drowning that looks like success from the outside. You forced me to look at myself, not as a provider or a son or a doctor, but as a man." I looked at him for a long moment, then set my mug down. "Gabriel," I said gently, "if we're going to have any relationship moving forward, it can't be based on guilt, or gratitude, or history." He blinked. "Then what respect?" I said. "Mutual respect." He nodded slowly. "I'm not angry anymore," I continued. "But I also won't be your safety net again. I won't offer you financial help. I won't rescue you when you feel lost. If you come to this house, it won't be because you need something. It'll be because you want to know me. Not just as your mother, but as a person." Gabriel looked down, then back up. "I understand. No conditions, no debts. But also no expectations that I'll fix your life. I wouldn't ask that." "I know," I said, "but I need to say it out loud. For both of us." He leaned back in his chair, staring out the window. For a moment, we were both silent. "I'd like to come just to talk," he said finally. "Not about the past. About now. About what matters to you," I smiled. "That would be nice. And maybe I could bring my guitar next time. You could show me some of the old songs you used to play. I'd like that very much." We sat in that small kitchen with its scuffed countertops and sun-faded curtains, and for the first time in years, I felt something shift. Not the dramatic kind of shift you see in movies where violins swell and hugs happen in slow motion. No, this was quieter, deeper, the kind of shift you feel in your bones. He stood to leave a little while later, but before he reached the door, he turned back. "Can I hug you?" I hesitated, just for a breath, then opened my arms. It wasn't a performative hug. It wasn't rushed. It was full and firm and honest. He held on just a second longer than I expected, like he needed it more than he knew how to say. I patted his back lightly. "You're learning." He stepped back and smiled. "From the best." After he left, I stood in the doorway for a while, watching the dust settle in the air where he'd just been. I didn't cry. I didn't even sigh. I just stood there, feeling the sun on my face, knowing something new had begun. Not a return to the old way, not a tidy reconciliation, but a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are the bravest part. It had been almost 2 years since Gabriel stood on my doorstep and asked for forgiveness, not with words, but with the weight of quiet presence. Since then, he had slowly, carefully earned his way back into my life. Not through grand gestures, but through consistent humility, a shared meal, a question about my garden, a conversation that wasn't about the past, but about now. One Thursday afternoon, just as I was deadheading marigolds in the front yard, he pulled up and stepped out with a familiar calm in his walk. He no longer approached me with that anxious energy I once knew too well. This version of my son was slower, more grounded. A man who had fallen and learned not to fear the ground. He helped me finish in the garden, brushing dirt from his jeans as we sat on the porch steps. "I'm going on a volunteer trip next week," he said casually. "A small town in the hills. Rural clinic work. We'll be there for 5 days treating patients who don't have access to regular care." I nodded. "That sounds like work that matters." "It is," he said. Then almost shyly, I was wondering if you'd want to come with me. I turned to look at him surprised. It's not glamorous, he added quickly, but the place is beautiful. There's a lot of quiet, and I thought, maybe we could share the road trip, see the countryside together. You've traveled on your own before, I know. But maybe this time we go as, I don't know, two people who respect each other. I didn't answer right away. Not because I doubted him, but because I wanted to feel the weight of what he'd just offered. An invitation not rooted in obligation or guilt. An open door, not a handout. I'd like that, I said. We left the following Monday in Gabriel's used pickup with a cooler full of sandwiches and a playlist of songs from his childhood that made us both laugh more than we expected. We passed through small towns where antique shops outnumbered gas stations, stopped once to pet a stray dog, shared silence when there was nothing to say, and comfort when there was. At the clinic, Gabriel worked long hours while I helped serve meals to volunteers and folded fresh towels for patient cots. I watched him move through the rooms with ease and care, listening closely, never rushing, kneeling to speak to a child, looking old farmers in the eye when they spoke slowly. He was no longer the man performing for status. He was simply serving. And I wasn't there as the mother who once cleaned his messes or financed his ambitions. I was just Dolores, a woman who knew how to fold a blanket neatly and offer someone a warm plate of food with grace. One night after the last patient had gone, we sat outside the clinic under a sky crowded with stars. The mountains loomed in the dark, soft shapes that reminded me of Patagonia. The silence was rich, not empty. I think this is who I was always meant to be, Gabriel said. It just took me a long time to find him. I smiled. Sometimes we build ourselves out of the ruins. He looked at me, his eyes softer than I'd ever seen them. Do you ever wish things had happened differently? I thought for a moment, then shook my head. No, I said. Because if they had, I might never have found myself either. We sat there, two grown-ups, who had both made mistakes, both paid their own prices. Not mother and son in the traditional sense, but two people who had chosen to rebuild something more honest than what we had before. When we returned home, Gabriel dropped me off with a quiet hug and no big declarations. That was how we operated now, without noise, without performance, just presence. I walked into my house, Beethoven wagging his tail, and took off my shoes by the door. The living room was warm. The herbs in the kitchen window had grown wild and tall. A postcard from Maria and João in Brazil sat on the table with a photo of them smiling under a waterfall. I poured myself tea, sat at my writing desk, and opened the journal I'd been slowly filling since Patagonia. I flipped to a new page and wrote the words I had finally come to understand. Loving someone doesn't mean surrendering yourself. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not erasing. It is not pretending it didn't hurt. Forgiveness is reclaiming your peace without needing to rewrite the past. Loving again after being broken is not weakness. It's wisdom. It's strength that doesn't roar. It simply stands. And boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks. They open when they should and close when they must. I signed the bottom with my name, Dolores, a woman who had once given too much, then taken it all back, then slowly chose to give again. But this time on her own terms, a woman who had finally learned that love isn't suffering, and that the most important act of self-preservation is saying no when no one else will say it for you. Sometimes saving yourself is the most radical form of love. And sometimes saving yourself is what finally makes space for someone else to become who they were meant to be. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt taken for granted or struggled to set boundaries with someone you love, know that you're not alone. Have you ever had to choose your own peace over pleasing someone else? When was the moment you finally said, enough? We'd love to hear your experience in the comments below. Your story might be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if these kinds of stories speak to your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new one. Because sometimes the quietest voices carry the deepest truths.